Leia, do you remember your mother? Your real mother?
Just a little bit. She died when I was very young.
What do you remember?
Just images, really. Feelings.
Tell me.
She was very beautiful. Kind, but sad. Why are you asking me this?
I have no memory of my mother. I never knew her.
Luke, tell me, what's troubling you?
For thousands of years, stories have had this tendency to come full circle. There's something deeply satisfying about a story in which the end connects with the beginning. It allows us to continuously view the story in new ways, so that we can carry it with us into the future. By the time Episode 9 comes out, Star Wars will have taken 4 decades to complete the story of the Skywalker family. Every theory I've seen about Rey's origins, except for one, has failed to capture what I would describe as the necessary level of emotional fulfillment to close out this modern-day epic. For me, the answer that does this is that Rey and Ben Solo are the reborn Padme and Anakin, here to finish what they started. And within this context, Rey represents so much more than just a new hero. Star Wars is a family soap opera, a fantasy fairy tale, and a modern-day myth. Before you click away, give me at least a small chance to prove to you that these ideas have merit. I think it'll be good to start with demonstrating that George Lucas was thinking along these lines when he set out to make Star Wars. One of the best interviews Lucas ever had was with Bill Moyers. I've linked it in the description and I highly recommend reading it. I think what this interview demonstrates is that the inspiration behind the character of Anakin, and the entire saga in general, really is drawing heavily from widespread mythological motifs. It's safe ground to use these things to speculate about the story going forward. Another great interview I've linked is The Cult of Darth Vader, done with Rolling Stone. Here, Lucas says that Anakin's birth circumstances were inspired by a long line of mythological heroes, not just Christ. And, to me, it never really sat right that Anakin wouldn't play an extremely important role in the sequel trilogy, despite Lucas saying he was the central figure of the first 6 films. I know I've talked about this before, but George Lucas had a great relationship with the comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell.
Star Wars producer-director George Lucas.
About 10 years ago, I set out to write a children's film. I had an idea of doing a modern fairy tale. Stumbled across A Hero with a Thousand Faces. After reading more of Joe's books, I began to understand how I could do this. It was a great gift, and a very important moment. If I don't, it's possible that if I hadn't run across that, I would still be writing Star Wars today.
I just want to be honest and let you all know that the basis of my speculation about this trilogy draws from Joseph Campbell's ideas and what other fans have told me about the saga. When a friend told me to read Joe's books to understand Star Wars better, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. 6 books later, I still feel like I've barely scratched the surface of what there is to know about all this. Before jumping into the meat and potatoes of why I think Star Wars is pointing us in this direction, let me just share some words from Campbell about this death and rebirth theme that has appeared time and time again within the world's great mythologies. In the imagery of mythology and religion, this birth, or more often rebirth theme is extremely prominent. In fact, every threshold passage, not only this from the darkness of the womb to the light of the sun, but also those from childhood to adult life and from the light of the world to whatever mystery of darkness may lie beyond the portal of death, is comparable to a birth and has been ritually represented practically everywhere through an imagery of re-entry into the womb. For the rest of this video, I'm going to do my best to organically talk about Star Wars, highlighting the mythological clues that point us in the direction of this theory. I'm going to start with this image. What does this look like to you?
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
In all seriousness, within the context of that Joseph Campbell quote, the imagery of this cave entrance being modeled off the female reproductive system is deliberate. For thousands of years, the Earth, the universe, whatever you want to call it, has been thought of as a female entity. Why? Because humans have always been in awe of the female power to bear and produce a child. Men have a much easier job when it comes to producing children. And in the minds of the ancients, if female humans give birth, then the universe, which gave birth to all of us, is probably some sort of female spirit. In other words, the Force is female. Before I move on, remember that the island of Ahch-To and the Force Tree and the first Jedi Temple is like a giant mythological checklist for exploring this grand mystery of the cosmos. We'll come back to all of this later. In order to begin even thinking that Rey being Padme is plausible, we have to go back and look at the female aspect of this entire story, starting with Shmi and Padme. The prequels are Act 1 of this big story, and as such, they occupy that portion of the hero's journey in which nothing in the world is quite right. In the prequels, everything is out of balance. The Jedi and the Republic are not in balance with each other, the Jedi are not in balance with themselves, and the Sith are not in balance with anything. And Anakin is not in balance with Padme. The simple truth to this balance question is revealed in Episode 1 using the theme of symbiosis. In a symbiotic relationship, the two partners work for each other rather than for themselves. This is the exact opposite of a Sith master-apprentice relationship. In many ways, Episode 1 functions as a sort of prologue to the entire story. Whereas some people think this means it can be skipped, I draw the exact opposite conclusion. The Phantom Menace establishes the biggest problems, questions, and mysteries that need to be addressed in the next 8 movies. With that said, we should expect some pretty big mistakes to be made in the Phantom Menace that go on to have extreme repercussions later. The first is separating Anakin from his mother, Shmi. Qui-Gon was the wisest Jedi in the prequels, and one who was willing to disobey the Jedi to do the right thing if he thought it was necessary. But at the same time, Qui-Gon has not grasped the entire truth of the mystery he's unraveling, which is that of the Chosen One, Anakin Skywalker. Shmi, on the other hand, is a completely selfless individual, and this is reflected in Anakin's personality as a young boy who...
He knows nothing of greed.
Anakin in Episode 1 is a flawless kid, who dreams of freeing all the slaves and wants to help everyone he meets. This proves that Shmi was doing a better job raising him than the Jedi ever could. So, Lesson 1, don't take kids away from their loving mothers to place them within an order of space wizards who have weird taboos on things like love and attachment. That was Qui-Gon's biggest mistake. And a curious thing happens when he makes his bet with Watto. Qui-Gon disobeys fate by using the Force to make sure that he frees Anakin instead of his mother. Let's see what would have happened if Qui-Gon had just let the Force do its thing. Anakin wins the pod race, Shmi is freed. Anakin must stay on Tatooine with her because Shmi would never abandon her son. Later, Shmi meets her future husband who buys Anakin's freedom because he loves Shmi. And now, Anakin has a complete family to grow up with, where he gets proper emotional development. Qui-Gon prompted a different fate. But here's the thing about that. The final duel of the Phantom Menace is against the music that is aptly titled the Duel of the Fates. What this means is that the outcome of this duel is effectively locking in stone a certain fate. If Qui-Gon had lived, we know that he would have disobeyed the Council if he thought Anakin wasn't turning out to be a good person. He'd have taken Anakin right out of his training and plopped him back with his mother, who was doing things right, and he'd remain around as a mentor figure to help Anakin along his journey of discovering the Force. In this scenario, Anakin grows up to be a wise and powerful Force user who has compassion and love in his heart. He'd be around to end Palpatine or any other threat even if the Jedi get wiped out, and the horrible fate of the galaxy gets avoided. But Qui-Gon didn't win the fight with Maul. He died, and with him, that alternate fate. Instead, it was Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Paragon Jedi, who would train Anakin, and he'd do things by the book. Padme also makes a critical mistake in this film. She gives into fear when she listens to Palpatine, literally whispering in her ear like a serpent, in calling a vote of no confidence. But Padme gives into fear for a justifiable reason, to try and stop the suffering of her people. And it highlights one of the biggest problems with the world at this point. There is no compassion in the Republic.
It is clear to me now that the Republic no longer functions. I pray you will bring sanity and compassion back to the Senate.
But here's the thing. Getting Palpatine elected did nothing to help anyone. Padme, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Anakin have to go save the Naboo anyways, and the Republic and Palpatine are nowhere to be seen. In fact, the most progress Padme makes is when she stops letting her alter ego speak for her and when she humbly makes herself the equal of the Gungans and asks for their aid. This is a clear contrast in decision-making. One with her mask on in the Senate chamber, and one with her mask off in the presence of the Gungans. Ultimately, this is the reason why I think Padme has to be back again in the sequels to make things right. The victory at the end of The Phantom Menace was really no victory at all, because Palpatine won, and he knows it. He got everything he needed to keep cementing himself further in power. Let's shift gears now to mythology. One of the most common themes is that the gods and goddesses choose their families from beyond the mortal realm. That goes for their spouses as well. Keeping this in mind, another curious thing occurs in Episode 1. Qui-Gon is so fixated on Anakin that he ignores the other 2/3 of the equation standing right in front of him. If Anakin is the Force incarnate, then the people the Force chose to bring balance to him were Shmi and Padme, two very wise, selfless, and ultimately good individuals. These two female characters represent a principle that is lacking in the entire prequel trilogy, one that gets sidelined in favor of a quest for power by all the major characters. Padme states in Episode 1 what the problem is.
This war represents a failure to listen.
I don't believe that. And you're sounding like a separatist.
A common mythic image is of the hero and the goddess represented in two forms, as mother and as spouse. If I had to wager, the comic relief two-headed alien at the pod race was a slight nudge at the idea that Padme and Shmi are a majority of the solution to this problem. Shmi's name actually comes from the last part of the Hindu goddess Lakshmi, who is the deity of wealth, fortune, and prosperity. Not just of the material kind, but of the spiritual sort as well. To me, this symbolizes Shmi's ability to impart spiritual wisdom and moral wisdom onto Anakin, before he becomes old and powerful enough to change the world for better or for worse. One could even make the argument that Shmi was the original chosen one, since she's the first being that the Force chose to do anything. And what was she chosen for? To raise the incarnate Force and teach it the same thing that all mythologies have tried to teach for thousands of years, that God is love. For further exploration of these mythic ideas, I've linked some basic Wikipedia pages in the description. These stories usually have the common thread of death and rebirth, a many-aspect goddess, a god and goddess being each other's eternal lovers who periodically descend into the mortal plane, and other things. For now, let us move on to another huge mythological theme that is right there in Revenge of the Sith. If you've ever told yourself that Padme's death makes no sense, I've got good news for you. It makes a lot of sense when thought about within the context of myth. One of the most common motifs used in these types of stories is that of a spouse who follows their lover into the underworld, which in this case is Vader going into the suit. If Anakin was the dark side of the relationship and Padme the light, then at the pit of this descent, Anakin represents true selfishness and Padme true selflessness. And if we are to believe that the two are connected by their love of each other in the sense of soulmates, the death of Padme takes on an entirely new dimension. We shouldn't trust a medical droid's knowledge of the Force. What it means when it says she lost the will to live is different from what is actually happening. Palpatine looking surprised and pleased to find out that Vader managed to somehow survive this death is a telling signal that something big has just happened. To me, the mythological answer here is that, as soulmates, Vader was able to, while blinded by his hatred and rage, keep himself alive by drawing out the life force from his other half, unconsciously. When Palpatine tells Vader that in his anger he killed her, I think he is being 100% honest, but there is always another side to these questions and myths. Padme, as the extreme embodiment of selflessness and while still having faith that there is good in Anakin, unconsciously surrenders that life force so that he can go on living. And let's face it, she has 2 living, breathing children. She has every reason to keep living, if only to raise them herself and be there for them. So the droid's answer is insufficient. What we have witnessed in this scene is Star Wars' version of this motif. Padme dies so that Anakin can live, effectively following him into the underworld. Death and rebirth, this time negative. And this further highlights yet another angle on this idea of things not in balance. Anakin and Padme weren't equals. Anakin had all the Force power, while Padme had none. Yet she was the one with the wisdom that made her worthy to wield such power. And she was always there, on the other side of life, as Vader's inner light that was pulling him back toward the side of good. The comics demonstrate this on at least one notable occasion. An enemy stuns Vader and he experiences a vision. Padme tells him to just give up and accept his death so that he can be with her, but he suppresses it, believing it's too late, just like Kylo. I actually think C-3PO in The Empire Strikes Back explains the entire problem of balance in this relationship in a comic relief line.
I believe, sir, it says that the power coupling on the negative axis has been polarized. I'm afraid we'll have to replace it.
Well, of course I'll have to replace it.
Here, Chewie.
I think we better replace the negative power coupling.
Sir, I've isolated the reverse power flux coupling.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're perfectly welcome, sir.